You don't belong at this table. This is our Thanksgiving, not yours." Those words came from my son-in-law's mouth while I was standing in my own dining room, holding a casserole dish I'd spent 2 hours making, wearing the apron my late wife had given me for our 35th anniversary. I remember the way the room went quiet. My daughter looked down at her plate. My grandson, 7 years old at the time, kept pushing a piece of bread around like he hadn't heard a thing, even though I could see his little shoulders tense up. I set the casserole down on the counter, not the table, because apparently I wasn't welcome there, and I walked back to the kitchen. I didn't say a word. People have asked me since then why I didn't fight back right away, why I just went quiet. Honestly, I was 63 years old, and I had spent my whole life believing that family didn't do things like this. Part of me was still waiting to wake up. My name is not important. What matters is this. I worked for 31 years in property management in Central Ohio. Not glamorous work, but honest work. I saved carefully, invested modestly, and when my wife passed from pancreatic cancer 6 years ago, I was left with a paid-off house, a small rental property across town, and a grief so heavy I didn't know what to do with my hands anymore. My daughter. I'll call her my daughter because that's what she is, whatever else has happened between us, moved back home about 8 months after her mother died. She said she needed a fresh start. She'd been living in Indianapolis with her boyfriend at the time, things hadn't worked out, and she came back to Columbus with 2 suitcases and a sadness in her eyes that reminded me so much of her mother that I couldn't say no. I wouldn't have said no anyway. She was my child. She met her husband at a gym about a year after she moved back in. I'll call him my son-in-law, though I've had to work hard to keep using that word neutrally. He was 34, worked in sales, drove a leased truck that was too big for any parking space he ever tried to fit it into. First time I met him, he shook my hand and told me he'd heard a lot about me. He had one of those smiles that moves fast across someone's face and disappears before it reaches their eyes. They got engaged after 6 months. Married in my backyard the following June. I paid for the catering. I mowed that lawn myself the morning of the wedding. At first, things were manageable. They lived in an apartment about 20 minutes away. My son-in-law would come over for Sunday dinners, sometimes, eat most of what was on the table, and talk a great deal about opportunities he was about to pursue. I noticed he changed jobs twice in the first year I knew him. He always had an explanation that made the last employer sound unreasonable. The request to move in came about 18 months after the wedding. My daughter called me on a Tuesday night, and I could hear in her voice that she'd rehearsed it. The lease was up, they were trying to save money, it would only be for a year, maybe less. She said my son-in-law had a new position that was going to change everything for them financially, and they just needed a bridge. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I set up the guest suite on the 2nd floor, bought new towels, cleared out the closet. I made room. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing, was that the new position fell through within 3 weeks of them moving in. My son-in-law didn't tell me. My daughter didn't tell me. I found out 2 months later when I overheard a phone call. He didn't realize I could hear from the hallway. By that point, certain things had already started shifting in the house. Small things at first. He rearranged the furniture in the living room without asking. He started referring to the refrigerator as our fridge, meaning him and my daughter, and would give me a look if I moved something he'd put on a shelf. He took over the television remote with a confidence that suggested he believed this was simply the natural order of things. My daughter went along with all of it. I told myself she was trying to keep the peace. I told myself she was under pressure. I told myself a lot of things. The first real confrontation happened around the 6-month mark of them living with me. I had plans to have my old neighbor, a man I'd known for 15 years, come over for dinner on a Saturday. My son-in-law informed me, not asked, informed that he and my daughter were having people over that same night, his friends. A small get-together, he said. I told him I already had a commitment. He looked at me the way someone looks at a child who said something that doesn't quite make sense. Then he said, "We'll just use the back patio. It shouldn't be a problem." It wasn't a question. I moved my dinner to a restaurant. I told my friend the kitchen was being worked on. I've thought about that moment many times since. That was when I should have said something clearly. Instead, I accommodated, and accommodation, I've learned, can teach the wrong lessons. The job situation didn't improve. My son-in-law did some consulting work here and there, but nothing steady. My daughter had a part-time position at a dental office that she'd taken when they moved in, and that became their main income. I never asked them to contribute to the household expenses. I probably should have, not for the money. I didn't need it, but because expectations that are never named don't exist for everyone in the same way. My son-in-law seemed to interpret my silence on the matter as confirmation that everything was provided and nothing was owed. The year mark came and went. Then 18 months. I started hearing my son-in-law refer to the house casually in conversation with his friends as our place. Once on a phone call he told someone the address and said, "Yeah, it's our house," without a pause, without any acknowledgement of what that meant or didn't mean. I mentioned it to my daughter quietly one evening. She said he didn't mean anything by it, that he was just trying to feel settled. She asked me if I was going to make this into something. I let it go. The Thanksgiving incident, the one that started this whole story, happened about 2 years into them living with me. I had done the grocery shopping the week before. I had planned the menu, bought the turkey, made my wife's cranberry relish recipe from a card she'd written out in her own handwriting that I keep in a plastic sleeve in the recipe box. My grandson was coming. My sister was driving up from Dayton. It was the first Thanksgiving in several years that I'd actually felt something close to anticipation. My son-in-law had decided, sometime in the days before, without discussing it with me, that this was going to be his event. He invited 8 additional people. His parents, his brother, a couple from their gym. He rearranged the dining room. He told me where to put things when I was setting up, as though I were a helper who had shown up to assist with his party. And when I came out of the kitchen carrying that casserole, he said what he said. "You don't belong at this table. This is our Thanksgiving, not yours." His mother laughed briefly, then covered it with a cough. One of his friends looked at the ceiling. My daughter said, "Honey," in a tone that carried no actual weight. I set down the casserole and went to the kitchen. I stood there for a moment with my hands flat on the counter. Then I went to my bedroom, closed the door, and sat down on the edge of the bed my wife and I had shared for 28 years, and I thought very carefully about what I was going to do next. What I did not do was cry, though I wanted to. What I did not do was go back out there and make a scene. What I did was open the Notes app on my phone and start writing down dates, conversations, and incidents. I'd been a property manager for 3 decades. I knew how important documentation was. I just never thought I'd need to apply that knowledge inside my own home. Over the next several weeks, I also did something else. I called my attorney. Her name is not important either, but she'd handled my wife's estate, and I trusted her completely. I explained the situation. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always respected about her. When I finished, she said, "You understand that you have every right to end this arrangement at any time." I did understand that, technically. What I needed was the map from where I was to where I wanted to be, without destroying my relationship with my grandson in the process. We talked through options. What I settled on was a formal notice of tenancy termination. Because legally, regardless of how it had felt, they were tenants, and I was the landlord. Under Ohio law, with a month-to-month arrangement that had never been put in writing, I needed to give 30 days' notice. My attorney drafted the letter. I signed it. I had it hand-delivered on a Wednesday morning when my son-in-law was home alone. He came to find me in the garage about 20 minutes later. I was cleaning up my workbench. I'd been restoring an old cedar chest that had belonged to my father-in-law, and he came through the side door without knocking. He was holding the letter in one hand, and his voice when he spoke had a quality I recognized. It was the voice of someone who has never actually been told no before and is momentarily unable to process the experience. "What is this?" I told him it was exactly what it appeared to be. He told me I couldn't do this. He used the phrase family home several times. He told me this would devastate my daughter. He told me my grandson needed stability. He told me at one point that I was being selfish, which I found remarkable given the circumstances. I let him finish. Then I told him that the 30 days would begin that Friday, that I hoped they would use the time to make solid arrangements, and that I was happy to provide a reference for rental applications, if that would help. He left without saying anything else. I heard the truck start and leave. My daughter called me about an hour later. She was crying, which broke something in me that I don't know how to describe cleanly. She told me I was tearing the family apart. She told me she didn't understand how I could do this. She asked me if her mother would have wanted this. That last question was the hardest one. I sat with it for a long time before I answered. I told her that her mother would have wanted her to treat people with dignity. I told her that her mother would have wanted her to stand up when she saw something wrong happening, even if it was uncomfortable. And I told her, as gently as I knew how, that I loved her, that I would always love her, but that I could not continue living the way the last 2 years had gone. She hung up. The 30 days were not easy. There was a period where my son-in-law would walk past me in the hallway without acknowledging my presence, which I found almost a relief compared to the alternative. My daughter went quiet in a different way, a careful, watchful quiet that I recognized from when she was a teenager and was trying to figure out how much trouble she was actually in. About 10 days in, my son-in-law came to me with a proposal. He said they needed 60 days instead of 30. He said he had a job offer in the works. The same phrasing I noticed that I'd heard before, and that 60 days would let them get established properly. He was calmer than he'd been in the garage. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and folded his hands in a way that I think he believed looked reasonable. I told him 30 days, as stated. He asked if I was doing this to punish him. I told him I was doing this because the situation had become untenable and that I wished them both well in their next chapter. He left the table. That night I heard them arguing in the guest suite, voices low but edges sharp, the sound carrying through the wall the way sound always does in old houses. They were out in 28 days. The first morning I woke up. Alone in my house again, I lay in bed and listened to the quiet for a long time. The refrigerator hum. A car passing on the street outside. A bird somewhere in the oak tree by the driveway. It was an ordinary Thursday in February, cold and grey, and it was the first morning in 2 years that felt entirely like mine. I made coffee. I sat in my chair by the window. I didn't turn on the television. I just sat there with the cup warm in both hands and let the quiet settle around me like something that belonged there. In the months that followed, I did several things I'd been putting off. I updated my will with my attorney, which I should have done sooner. I met with my financial advisor and restructured the way the rental property was held. Something that in hindsight, I'm grateful I hadn't done earlier when my son-in-law had casually suggested, twice, that he might be interested in helping manage it. I replaced the locks. I painted the guest room back to the color it had been before, a soft grey that my wife had picked out. My grandson came to see me about 6 weeks after they moved out. My daughter dropped him off and waited in the car, didn't come in, which stung, but I understood she wasn't ready. He walked in like he always had, went straight to the kitchen to see what I might have in the way of snacks, and sat down at the table while I made us both hot chocolate. We talked about his school project on the solar system. We looked through an old book I had about the Apollo missions. He showed me something on his tablet. It was a perfectly ordinary afternoon, and when my daughter's car pulled back up 2 hours later, he hugged me before he went out, a real hug, both arms, and told me he'd see me next time. I stood at the door and watched the car pull away. Then I went back inside to finish the crossword I'd started that morning. My daughter and I have spoken more in the last several months. It's careful, still, the way conversations are when trust has been damaged, and neither person quite knows how to handle the weight of what's been between them. But she called me on my birthday in March. She called me when my grandson had a small part in his school play. She called me once, late on a Sunday, and didn't say much of anything, just talked about a show she'd been watching and asked how my back was holding up. I take that as something. My son-in-law I have not spoken to, I don't expect to. Some doors close in a way that doesn't invite reopening, and I've made my peace with that. I'm 65 now. I've buried my wife, I've managed difficult tenants, I've sat across from people in negotiations where everyone in the room wanted something different. I know that not every story ends with a reconciliation scene where someone cries and someone forgives, and everything is resolved with a handshake. Some stories end with you sitting in your kitchen on a cold February morning, drinking your coffee, listening to the refrigerator hum, and feeling, for the first time in too long, like the ground beneath your feet belongs to you. That's enough. That's more than enough. I want to ask you something before I go, because I'm curious about the people listening to this. Have you ever been made to feel like a stranger in your own home? And what did you do about it? Leave a comment. I'd really like to know. And tell me where you're listening from.